It's not the pencils or the paper. It's not the smart boards, the playgrounds, or the buildings that make Texas public schools. It's the people, the teachers, counselors, coaches, principals, and superintendents that make a school district thrive. And the secret ingredient to great schools is great leadership. Stronger superintendents, principals, and teachers create brighter futures for students. And while leadership is not a skill people are born with, it can be taught. That's why we exist. We are the Holdsworth Center, a nonprofit organization that provides world-class leadership training programs to help build stronger leaders for Texas students. If you believe that public education holds worth, visit us at holdsworthcenter.org.
Good evening. We are so glad that you are with us tonight. My name is Lindsay Wharton, and I am the president of the Holdsworth Center. If this is your first time on campus, we want you to know that this is a place that is dedicated to lifting up public education in the state of Texas and lifting up the people who invest their hearts and their minds and their energy into our students every day. So when you're not here, this room is filled with teachers and principals and superintendents, but when they're not here, we're glad to put this space to use to build community and bring people together for some really enriching conversations. You can learn more about us if you'd like to. There's some pamphlets on your materials, but we want to dive right in because we are so privileged to have Dr. Imani Perry with us tonight, and we're so lucky to have the opportunity to have her here with us in Texas. And that opportunity was made possible through a partnership with the Texas Book Festival. And so I want to invite up Marianne De Leon, the CEO of the Texas Book Festival, to welcome us to this space.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. The Texas Book Festival exists to connect authors and readers through experiences that celebrate literacy, imagination, and ideas, and I am certain we are going to do that tonight. Thank you to the Holdsworth Center and to Imani Perry for being here to do that with us. We're so grateful to the entire team at the Holdsworth Center who have just welcomed us here, and hopefully we have made a good showing. We have a huge number of our board members, our advisory board members, and our staff here, and we're super excited to see how this partnership blossoms in the future. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. So we call this conversation series Place the Ladder. And one other thing to know about Holdsworth, if you're here for the first time, is that we are the vision, inspiration, and outcome of the investment of a person named Charles Butt. He may associate with HEB. And you're not going to see very much about Charles on the campus, but on your way out, you're going to see a quote that he loves, which is leaders find the walls and place the ladder. And this conversation series is an opportunity for us to spotlight people who exemplify leadership, who have advice for leaders, and who also are strengthening public education in a variety of ways. So we are so glad to have you with us.
No, thank you for having me.
Yeah. And I frequently am in the position of saying this is a person who needs no introduction, and here we go anyway. So if somehow you don't know Dr. Imani Perry, she is a decorated scholar and author and has written now 9 books of nonfiction, including the National Book Award-winning South to America, and her most recent book, Black and Blues, How a Color Tells the Story of My People. It was the most anticipated book of 2025 from Time and USA Today, and elsewhere the New York Times declares, reading Black and Blues is like putting on a pair of those special Kodak 3D viewfinders that make objects and issues leap suddenly into focus. In 2023, Dr. Perry was named a MacArthur Fellow and joined the faculty at Harvard University after 10 years at Princeton and 7 years at Rutgers Law. She is the co-founder of the Black Teacher Archive, a digitized collection of papers that reveals the intellectual, political, and cultural contributions of Black educators through the Civil Rights era. Please join me one more time in welcoming Dr. Imani Perry. So in your book, Breathe, there was a line where you said, our pedigrees can overwhelm even the most straightforward narrative and distort me and distort you. And so I'd love to invite you, I mean, I gave just a sample of your accomplishments, but what else should we know about you and who you are and what you bring to this conversation?
Well, first, let me just say thank you so much for having me both. It's wonderful to be at the Holdsworth Center. It's wonderful to be invited by the Texas Book Festival and to be in community with all of you and to see friends among you. So I often anchor myself in this way. I am Nita Mae Garner's grandbaby, and I am a daughter of Birmingham, Alabama. I was born 9 years after and a few miles away from the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. And this has a more pointed significance actually this week because the day before my launch, the night before my launch, well, I should say the book starts in my grandmother's bedroom, which was my first bedroom, which is blue, and had blue bedspread, blue drapes, blue prayers written in the corner of the mirror, picture of 2 little bluebirds on the wall. And the night before my launch, the house burned down. And I'm still I'm in a period of grieving. I keep thinking, how do you have a funeral for a house? But that place was my anchor. And so over and over again, we return there in my writing. And so now the writing will actually be the place where it resides. But that's, everything that I do actually begins in that location. So these other sort of points along the journey all continuously harken back. Yeah.
And one thing I always want to ask guests is to learn a little bit about who you were as a young person and the forces and the people and the experiences that shaped who you become and the work that you do now.
Yeah. I was, on the sweet side, I was a voracious reader, always. Someone was taking a photograph of me a couple of years ago, and I was in my library, and he was like, "You seem like you're getting emotional," and I was like, "This is my life." But I also was a fighter as a small child. My cousin, who I promise I won't be depressing, but my cousin Dwayne, with whom I was very close, who passed away last summer. Whenever I would give a talk, when I go home to Birmingham and give a lecture, he would tell everybody how I used to beat him up. Dwayne was like 6'3" and 240 pounds. And so he was like, "She looks small." She used to beat me up all the time. So, a little scrappy and into the book world, from the beginning.
Yeah. And what led you to your work as a scholar and as a writer?
Oh, I guess, I'm a movement baby. My parents were organizers. My mom is an intellectual. She's probably the most cerebral person I know. So I grew up in a world of books and ideas and hearing people talking constantly about how to get us to a world that was closer to just and free for everybody. And it was a very international milieu. People were coming from all corners of the world in our home. So that's a piece of it, but then there was also, I realized when I got to college that there was this job you could do where you read and wrote all the time. And I sort of, that seemed like right for me. And I will say this, the transition from sort of being solidly identified as a scholar to someone for whom writing is as much art as it is research-based is a transition that for me it's really taken over the course of the last 7 years, but that's a transition that for me has come through getting closer to what is really in my heart, what I really wanted to do. I always wanted to be a writer. And then I was like, there's a job where you can write, but that was, being a professor, and sort of opening up the spiritual and the heart-based aspects of the endeavor of writing is getting closer to sort of the child me, and what drove the child me over the past couple of years. You
talk at one point in the book about how when folks ask you, who's your inspiration, you often point to musicians.
Yes.
And that confuses people.
Yes, I actually was up for a fellowship. I did get it, which was astonishing given that they thought my response was weird. But they asked me who was the writer who most influenced me, and I said Thelonious Monk. And they're like, that's not what we were thinking of. And I, but you know, there is the composition part, particularly because I am kind of an associative writer. So this book has a kind of, it's chronological, it has a kind of narrative aspect, but I'm drawing from bits and pieces. It's like a quilt, or it's like a musical composition. There's this beautiful essay that I often cite that the critic, who's a jazz critic and also a writer of fiction, Albert Murray, who's also like one of my heroes, even though there's lots we disagreed about, that Albert Murray wrote about Romare Bearden, the visual artist, who was one of his best friends. Albert Murray, people know Romare Bearden more, but Albert Murray gave the names to all of Romare Bearden's artwork, so they were very close. And he wrote this essay, Murray wrote this essay on Bearden, and he says the thing that you can see is, like, you look at Bearden's pieces and they depict scenes and places, and you say, oh, this scene looks like, this is a really rough summary of what he's doing. He's much more eloquent, but he's like, it just gives you it's a picture that looks like something you know in the history of art. And he said, so you think about, and many of Bearden's pieces were collages. He said, but what you don't necessarily see looking at the surface of the piece is that he's actually working like a jazz musician. He's cutting out little shapes and putting them together. And then sometimes the shapes don't go together, so he moves this out and brings something else in. And for me, it's one of those pieces where I'm like, that's exactly what I'm trying to do when I write, is composition. There's riffs, there's trills, there's moans, there's shouts, and to try and mix the pieces together so that they fit and make a composition that can resonate with the reader. Yeah, so.
And reading this book, one of the things I was most curious about is, how did this start for you? What was the first piece that came together?
So it's a good question. I mean, I guess the first piece was actually that moment that the book begins with my little cousin Ian, and where he and I both love blue. He's 12 now, but he was very small then, and I asked Ian, which is your favorite color, blue, and he pointed up to the ceiling in my grandmother's room, and we all slept in this room. Like, we call it the home house in Black Southern tradition. I mean, this was the core space for us. And there was, when people dropped ceilings to save money on heating, so the ceiling was dropped, but one of the tiles was one of my male cousins, some shenanigans, there was a missing ceiling tile. And you could see the original color blue through that tile, and he pointed up and he said, that one. And there was something about that moment, that all of these ways I'd been collecting blues and thinking about the color, there's something that just coalesced in that moment, like that one, and it was like this portal, and it was this brilliant blue. It was a blue that was more reminiscent of the skies in Alabama in the summer times, and the blue on the walls had faded because of time and smoke and all of the things, and so it was one of those moments where I said, okay, I need to follow this path. Yeah.
And one of the things that stood out throughout the book was the different ways that you would use blues almost as a paradox. So to point out, the way we use blues in language to talk about sadness, about suffering, about pain, but also blues as this deliberate choice to be joyful, to connect, to create. And I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about that. Yeah,
I mean, it's part of the reason that I think that it resonates so deeply, so tied to Black experience, I mean, it starts, the book, part of what I talk about, and this in some level is obvious, but it's so easy to forget, is that people of African descent were not Black before, the age of conquest, right? People were all the various things that they were, not even Africans necessarily. These are terms that are imposed externally. So people are Akan and Yoruba and Igbo and Ibibio and all of, and that there is this category that is imposed, and it's imposed as justification for a kind of vicious cruelty and captivity. And that the meanings of the sky and the waters become something devastating and cruel because of the Middle Passage, right? And then people, what is remarkable is the people who are suffering under this designation create something beautiful out of it and meaningful and embrace it. And so, and there's lots of ways that shows up with blue. So one of the things I talk about it with indigo is the transition from indigo being this color that, crafts people in Kano, Nigeria, they make this beautiful indigo dye. Indigo captivates the whole world. And then at a moment of transition in the slave trade, people are no longer just creating indigo, they're being traded for indigo, right? So to imagine wearing indigo and then having your value as a human being reduced to a block of dye. And then, traveling across the waters, and then I tell the story of the sort of development of the indigo trade in South Carolina, and through Eliza Pinckney, she's the person who's known. She was a plantation owner, a young woman, who was really trying very hard to cultivate indigo, and she can't do it. And they invite a black man from a plantation somewhere in the French Caribbean. They don't name him, they don't name which island he's coming from. And he's the person who teaches her how to cultivate indigo. And then the plantation is lucrative. And that's, and so part of the way that, race and racism are constructed is that there is not attribution to that person's skill. But then the other piece, which goes to, which is my long-winded way of getting to answer your question, is that the embrace of that color continues, right? So Haint Blue porches in South Carolina, right, are that protect from evil spirits. So people of black folks have used that historically. The desire for indigo clothing, right? The love of the color is retained in the face of the devastation that is wrought on people's lives. And so it's that reinterpretation, it's that constant renegotiation, and as a way of making sense of one's own life, is that what I'm trying to get to. So blackness and blues go hand in hand.
And that last bit that you offered, the other thing that stood out was the focus on improvisation.
Yes.
And that as kind of a core part of the Black experience and the Black American experience.
I mean, it's the improvisation, the workaround, the making do, right? That there are, and I've written about it in lots of places, that I think improvisation is this extraordinary gift Black people have offered the world. That improvisation begins with the sternness of discipline to understand how to, whatever you're doing, whether it's playing an instrument or playing life, right, or negotiating life, and then figuring out how to reimagine the order of things, to make sense of the world, to make sense of the sound, to create beauty in new ways. And that's at the heart of course, the blues and the blues to jazz, right? The transition of the blues tradition to jazz, which is one of the other themes of the book. It's not just coincidence that the blue is the term for the blues. Yeah.
I was talking with some folks before the event and kind of asking them if they'd had an opportunity to read the book, what stood out to them, and people commented on how haunting the passages about the Middle Passage were in the book, and just how deeply impactful those were to read. And I was reminded when I was preparing this morning of a line from Breathe, that for me, that my people became, created, and imagined from a position of unfreedom is a source of deep pride and not shame. And to me, that came through so strongly in so many of the stories that you told as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that And I think about this because there are times when people, especially in this sort of social media age, right, you hear the most, that people think being descended from the enslaved is an insult. I just think the unbelievable spiritual grandeur of people to create something beautiful out of that condition. I mean, it's an enormous source of pride for me. And I also think that it's part of the reason that Black folks sort of capture the imagination of the world, I mean, people are because it's remarkable. There's something universal to learn about what it means to be a human being out of that.
So we are in Black History Month, and you highlighted in this book the importance of looking to the past to make sense of the present, and that being a useful practice in every instance.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, kind of as you stitch this quilt together, what you saw.
Okay, I want to say a little bit about Black History Month.
Right.
Since because, it's a bittersweet one. So this is 99 years since the official declaration by Carter G. Woodson. Next year will be 100 years of what was initially Negro History Week. 125 years this year from the penning of Lift Every Voice and Sing, which I've written a book about called May We Forever Stand. And that by James Weldon Johnson and Rosamond Johnson in Jacksonville, Florida. And they, in that moment, what was remarkable is that, what was called, Rayford Logan famously referred to the period post-Reconstruction as the nadir of American race relations, meaning the lowest point, right? The way in which Jim Crow settled upon the land and lynching and all kinds of exclusions and violence. And what I think was remarkable is that it's actually this moment of an incredible blossoming of African American culture, writing, art, organizational development. I mean, just so much happens in that period. And so Lift Every Voice and Sing was a piece of that. And then people begin the kind of practices, the routine practices in February, particularly with school children, that would become Negro History Week initially, and then in the 70s. And so it's 99 years since Negro History Week. It's 50 years since Black History Month, right? That was a transition. February because of Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass chose February for his birthday because he was enslaved and his birthday wasn't recorded. And so it became this ritual for largely educators to teach young people and also spread it to the larger community about the past and interpret it in a way that gave them the kind of dignity and fortitude for moving forward. And so to me, that lesson, one, as a beneficiary of being taught that lesson, but that it bears repeating constantly, right? There are lessons of the past, which ones we attend to, I think, vary based upon what we need at a given moment. But that's, that's sort of at the heart of every single thing that I write, is to think about the usable past and the usable present. So I talk about haunting the past because I'm always walking around in it to try to figure out what do we need to pay attention to in order to do something meaningful now.
Was there anything that you noticed or that has come top of mind for you having just finished this book at this time?
Oh, that's a great question. So I have been sitting with, and I don't actually know why, but I've been sitting this week with the periwinkle flowers. And so I tell the story in the book about how enslaved people in the Upper South would plant periwinkle flowers where their dead were buried as a way of marking that burial site. They didn't have headstones. And so there are places now where you'll see beds of periwinkle, and those are sites where the enslaved are buried. And I had this experience last year of going to North Carolina, to Edenton, North Carolina, on a sojourn where Harriet Jacobs, who wrote the classic slave narrative, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, where her family was and where her grandmother is buried. And that is actually a graveyard, but there are periwinkle all over the place in Edenton. And I just got very emotional. And I've been thinking about it, both because it's blue, blue flowers, hardy flowers, but also that there are different ways of marking home. And that home is where your dead are buried. And there is something about the resilience of the flowers, or to note that the people are here even when it was not documented, that feels really important to think about now. How do we hold space for kind of claim to belonging, a claim to a sense of home, even for those who may not be documented. Yeah.
The periwinkle flowers, the blue bottles, there were all of these moments in the book where I just had such a profound appreciation of the ability to see more of the world that maybe you didn't see before learning and through what you've shared. So just want to appreciate your scholarship. If you're open to it, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about school.
Yeah.
Okay. You've written some about your experience of school, and some of those experiences you've highlighted teachers who were incredible, who saw you and who cared for you, who witnessed your passion, who believed in the magic of human imagination and the discipline to make it art. And you've talked about teachers who made you feel dismissed and diminished. And I'm curious kind of what encouragement, we have a lot of educators who can't be here with us, but who are online with us. What encouragement, what advice you would offer them about how to create the kind of classrooms in which each child would have the former experience and not the latter?
Yeah. I mean, I will say, and speaking as an educator myself, I function with the presumption of the default human state is curiosity. And we are curious, we are fairly universally intellectuals, and there are a series of experiences over the course of a life that alienate us from that. And if you can sort of try to undo the alienation, I think that you find that certainly all kids, I mean, by the time I get them, right? But children, and I remember people used to tell people things that my kids say, and they would say, oh, your kids are so smart. And I'm like, all the kids are smart. I'm just listening to them, right? Really. The other day I did a book event in Philadelphia, and after it was over, somebody ran up to me and said, I have, John Brocker, who was my high school history teacher, he's on the phone, right? Which happens to me all the time. And I always cry. Like, I see my former teachers and I cry and I'm ridiculous. And then he made the joke. He said he gave you a B. And I was like, yeah, he did. I remember he gave me a B, right? But there was something about, like, you asking that question made me think there was something about that moment, which was this notion of intelligence as having something to do with performance, and the sort of hierarchies we create amongst children. And that was notable because I didn't get that many B's in high school, right? It had nothing. It didn't have any bearing on my relationship with him as a teacher, who I really had a wonderful relation. I mean, we had a really good relationship, and so I think, to the extent that we can kind of untie those value and performance and actually, like, acknowledge the full humanity of the people who are standing in front of us, and that's young people are people, fully. I think that's helpful. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to offer one more question, then I'm going to open it up to questions. So this is your warning to get ready. I'm going to read one more thing that you wrote, because when I read it, I thought, the pieces in here, for me, if I could say, what's the purpose of our schools, I would want to echo a lot of what you shared. And this was an offering to your children, but frankly, I think if more often we set a purpose for our schools that is exactly what we would want for our children, we'd be better off. You said, I want you to be able to eat, to keep a roof over your head, to have some leisure time, to not struggle to survive. I want you to be appreciated for your labors and gifts. But what I hope for you is nothing as small as prestige. I hope for a living passion, profound human intimacy and connection, beauty and excellence. The greatness that you achieve, the hope I have for it, for you is a historic sort not measured in prominence. It is a kind rooted in the imagination. Imagination doesn't erase nightmares, but it can repurpose them with elaborate sense-making or troublemaking. And just want to say, what a beautiful vision for what education could be. And invite you, if there's anything you want to offer of how we move closer to that.
Well, I keep saying this, and I promise it's not a cop-out, but at every stop I'm always saying I'm probably not the best person to answer that question in this room. I mean, I am of the mind the younger you get, the harder education, harder the work of the educator is, right? So it is an incredible set of skills. I think maybe the answer is that we ought to listen to educators, and particularly master educators. It's fun, this world is so is so backwards in so many ways, right? That the people who know the most about how to tend to the souls of our community are often valued the least. And so master educators, people who've been in the classroom for many years, disproportionately women teaching young people, have all of this knowledge and are not listened to sufficiently. So I would say, my answer would be to listen to those who know.
Beautiful. What questions are in the room? We've got some microphones ready to come around.
I'm curious if there are stories about the color, these narratives that did not make it into the book, that were sort of hard to bring into the full scope of Black and Blues.
Yes. So the one I keep talking about, because it still hurts my feelings that it's not in the book, is about Vieques, off of the island off the coast of Puerto Rico that's largely, populations largely of African descent, where there were naval munitions testing for generations, poisoned the water and the land. And so, a space of human suffering and disregard, and there's also a bioluminescent bay that glows blue at night that now all the tourists like to go to, right? I was writing about it, and there's this one detail that really sticks in my craw, which is that, people are still suffering, tourists are going, and the Spaniards, when they left horses, so there's wild horses in Vieques, and tourists have been complaining because the horses are not well fed, so the horses look sick, and so American tourists are very upset about these sick-looking horses. And they're human beings who are whose land has been poisoned, and so I really wanted that to be in the book, and also because I have this circle through. I'm interested. I do all these arterial connections, so it's mostly it's the story is like sort of West Africa through U.S. history, but there's arteries, so there's various arteries to the French-speaking world, and whether we're talking about, Anyway, so I wanted to have arteries through the Spanish-speaking world, and I really loved that section. And my editor was like, Imani, it's just not fitting. And I kept let me rewrite it again. And so we went through that 3 times, and I was like, all right, fine, it'll show up someplace else. Yeah.
Hi. So I wrote it down so I won't forget.
Okay.
So what advice would you give writers and educators who are interested in learning and sharing about the history of our country, particularly from the perspective of the minoritized, but are employed within institutions like K-12 and higher ed, who are understandably grappling with all of the current and new executive orders being passed by the government?
Yeah. I mean, it's an easier question to answer for writers than for teachers, frankly. You know, I have taken a position that I don't tell other people how and when to risk. That is, you know, that I don't. But I do think that we have a collective responsibility to read the books anyway, to study the subjects anyway. Some of that has to happen outside of formal institutions. Some of it has, you know, some of it has to happen in communities. There was a time when Americans, and de Tocqueville talked about this, you know, had a very robust associational life. We had lots of organizations, and so there were other spaces in which to engage intellectually and politically, and absolutely in even more intensive way for African Americans, like, you know, just every kind of civic organization. And so the spaces for having different kinds of learning and community and writing groups and all the things were more robust. I think we have to rebuild that. But I'd also say, just generally speaking, a kind of civic engagement is useful even for changing the formal institutions. It's like, so who shows up at the school board meetings? You know, who shows up at the library? Who, you know, to insist upon all of our voices as part of the democratic experiment. I think that's important. Yeah, I don't know if it's a sufficient answer, but yeah.
Okay, we have a question from our online audience. Vicky W., thank you for submitting this question. She says, in Black and Blues, you say we are old among the young and very young among the old. For that reason, it makes sense that our connections to others, other Black people, and other Americans remain resilient, regardless of the border of nation states or states. Any suggestions on how to do that?
Oh. Well, I mean, some of the suggestions are in the book. I mean, I think it literally is being civically engaged with people in your communities who have sort of different origin points. You can definitely look to the history of the movement. There is, my mother always does this thing, and it's hilarious because she forgets that I was a little kid at the time, but she'll be like, oh, do you remember when everybody was coming from Guinea-Bissau and we had these organizing meetings in the 1976? Like, no, I was 3 years old, I don't remember. But I mean, but there's a track record of people organizing and seeing themselves, looking for points of connection transnationally or within a given community across different kinds of identity categories. But it actually requires a willingness to spend time cultivating relationships with others. And we have become so intensely individualized and also so intensely competitive. I mean, that is sort of when people talk about neoliberalism, they talk about all sorts of things, structured adjustment and marketization, you know, the marketization of everything. But a lot of it is the kind of people it makes of us, that we see ourselves as in a constant zero-sum game with other folks, and that in order to, I think, do that, right, to forge the connections requires that you actually are willing to share and be open and be in community with other people. So, easier said than done, but necessary.
Hi, I wanted to pick up on your comment earlier about home, and you commented home is where our dead or our ancestors are buried. And when I think about how increasingly mobile and diffuse our families are now, we in some ways become disconnected from a single source. And I guess I'm just curious how you think about what home means in that kind of setting. Are we losing it, or is it changing? And is that different in different cultures? And just how is home evolving in a more contemporary society? And what are the implications of that for us?
Yeah, it's a beautiful question, and I think it is absolutely a matter of interpretation. So when I say that, it's an assertion that has more to do with me than an objective truth, right? So I left Alabama at 3.5. That's my home. I mean, it's just, there's no other place that I've ever referred to as home. And it does have to do with the fact that that's where my people are buried. That's where my only place I've ever called my house, that is now gone, but that's the only. So I refer to the other places I have lived as the house, the apartment. I refer to my grandmother's home, that's home. Right? But that's a way of interpreting, you know, for some people don't have a clearly defined sense of home, that it is something that travels. It is, for some people, is where the people you love are, and so there's a kind of, you know, it's transient. So I think there are multiple interpretations. I do think it is useful, though, to explore the question in one's life, right? And to then figure out, because it's tied to your identity and what you think matters and who and what your values are and what relationships you give primacy to. So I would say, multiple definitions of home. And I will also say this, home is also not necessarily a warm and fuzzy thing. For some people, home is terrifying and terrorizing. So I also want to say just, that it's not necessarily the sort of romantic narrative that I have of home, and that also is worth sort of grappling with.
Kirsten, we've got a question in the front as well. Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Am I next?
Yeah, let's go to the back and then we'll come to the front.
Hello.
Hi.
You mentioned that musicians being a large part of how you are inspired when you write. And so immediately I thought about the correlation between blues music and Black people. And sometimes sometimes even when we're talking about Black skin, we correlate it with being so Black that it looks blue.
Yes.
And that shows up a lot in blues music. So I'm really curious, like, how does that show up a lot in your writing? Just like where else does your love affair with music and lyrics and the marriage between education and music and writing, where else does that show up for you? I'm really curious.
Yeah. So yes, Blue Black is in the book. It's in the book in a variety of ways. In the blues, but also its connection to hoodoo, also its connection to the old folklore about people with blue gums, Black people with blue gums, who not all Black people have blue gums, but blue gums was kind of, there was a myth that Black people with blue gums, if they bit you, they could kill you. And I sort of try to explore the meaning behind that, and also, so the spectrum is sort of blue-black to blue-eyed Black people, and to the capaciousness of the category because of the way race was constructed. So it's in there in various ways, but I don't think I have ever written anything that doesn't have music centrally involved in it. And there is this phenomenon, particularly amongst African American writers. We write about music a lot because it's sort of the art form that we're all chasing, because it's seen as the highest form of artistic achievement in our tradition. So I'm not unique, as you well know, of trying to get to where the musicians are.
Good evening, Dr. Perry.
Hi, friend.
Thank you so much for the trajectory of your work, for holding us so beautifully. I haven't yet had a chance to sit with this work of art that I'm sure it is from the descriptions you give and from tonight. I can't wait for that. My question is actually connected to the question about blues and thinking about Black folks as blues people, and going back to thinking about sort of educators and those who've experienced the kind of violence that many are surprised is happening right now in this nation, but that Black people are not surprised about, because we have a very long track record with the violence of this nation. I wonder if there are lessons that Black people, Black folks throughout the diaspora, but especially African Americans, have to teach America right now as folks who've gone through this long history of violence.
Yeah.
What does that mean? I mean, even in terms of thinking about right now, the way the governor is trying to force or is forcing down the throats of everyone, the voucher system, and trying to gut public education in the state of Texas completely, which I'm sure many teachers are up in arms and yelling about right now. And thank you all teachers for doing that every day. You do that. But I just wonder, are there lessons that black educators, sort of looking towards black folks as educators in a way of this nation in terms of dealing with America at its most racist, at its most homophobic? Thinking about us as blues people also reminds us so many queer folks were part of the blues tradition, right? So there were gender nonconforming folks, trans folks, who
Absolutely.
were pushing forward that blues tradition and were also had lessons to teach. So I wonder if there's something specific, you know, I do work on black queer folks, so I'm really excited about the possibility that especially black queer African-American folks might have something to teach black trans African-American folks to teach the nation right now if we only sit and listen like you listen to your children.
Yes. In a word, yes. And I think that this is why we do the work. We think it has continued relevance to one of the things, and then I tell my students this about Black studies as a field, right? So I'm putting on the scholar hat. It is one of the few fields that doesn't pretend that it doesn't have commitments and values. All academic fields have commitments and values and priorities. But there's something on the surface of Black studies that says we're interested in liberation, or we're interested in justice, we're interested in freedom. And so all that to say that part of the reason we do this work, where we're looking to sort of the usable past, is in order to get us closer to that. So I think there's a lot. So the simple answer to your question is that there is a great deal, past and present, to be taught. And I think a lot of it has to do with an ethic of human relation, right? How to get closer to being in right relation with other human beings and with the earth, and other living beings, in a context, in the midst of a history where stratification is actually like high and low and haves and have not, is actually at the core of the way the whole thing has been built, right? So it's pushing against the structure. At the level not just of, there's the level of social movement, but it's also an interpersonal lesson. There's the late great poet Nikki Giovanni. One of her poems that I love is the Alabama poem, and in the poem, she's a young woman, and she's studying at Tuskegee University, which is where most of my family went to school. And there's an old woman who walks by and is like, "Oh, you studying at the institute? I have something to teach you. I'm gonna teach you. Let me show you these feet. I'm gonna teach you something with these feet." And the idea of like, okay, you're off getting your fancy education. I'm gonna show you the marks of labor. Right? So this is a long-winded way of just nodding my head to what you're saying. There is a lot to be taught, but it requires a kind of humility and a recognition of the dignity that it should be understood as inherent in every human being. Yeah. Thank you, Lyndon.
Yeah, I was very interested in when you brought up, you sort of had me at a Thelonious Monk. That's where you really, as a jazz aficionado, improvisation is such a key thing. And improvisation is so critical to living in this crazy world.
Yes.
And so I'd like you just to comment on that in your work and how that improvisation has driven your work to all the insights you've had in terms of the past, bringing it to the present. And I'm not that familiar with your work until tonight, and I am blown away.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'll say is that one of the things, and I want to say this in a way that is not critical, but that I think is important. We live in an era where we're often, we make sense of things by associating them with a set of images that we've seen before, right? And so this becomes one of the issues, I think, with social movement organizing today, that, you know, people are like, who's the next Dr. King? Or in the writing world, who's the next James Baldwin? The repetition, and we sort of then look for the same moves of the past. And I think that actually lies contrary to the best of the tradition, which is improvisation. You have to try to reimagine, right? You don't want to just repeat the choreography of the past. You want to actually find new ways of trying to get to what you want to get to. So for me, the improvisation is actually not to honor but not be derivative, right? To honor but also then reimagine. In multiple ways. So this book started out as a kind of collection of essays that they were just going to be different essays about Black people in blue. And I was like, I think a story is necessary at this moment. It's not enough to sort of, there needs to be an arc so that we can sort of try to, the reader and I, because I think, you know, when you write, it's a relationship, right? So that it is a co-creation, even though I'm not there with the reader, right? We're making something together. So we have to be able to go on a journey that isn't just a set of sort of interesting observations, but that gets us to understand this pattern that in many ways is so devastating, but also a way to respond, a way to sort of take heart in our capacity to respond. So it's in everything from, I think, the way we sort of organize ourselves when we're dealing with adversity to improvisation in the way we compose. I am always trying to imagine different structures for writing because I'm trying to get towards sort of different possibilities about what writing can do, not just for me, but for the people who I'm writing and reading with, you know, which are the readers, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for this, and I'm interested in reading the book further to get more insight into who you are and what your perspectives are. But, you know, as a Black person, more as a Black female, we have to be very intentional and careful about what we say, when we say it, and where we say it. So I commend you for being bold and bringing this topic up and covering it. But I want to know more about what is the focus that you would like us to deem from this book, and what can we do going forward to emulate your work?
Well, you know, rather than emulation, I just hope that it resonates and then encourages more imagining and work that comes in a way that feels sincere and authentic from people who read it, right? That it prompts something that is useful. I think the main thing I want people to draw from it is one, a deep understanding of how much of this tradition that I'm identifying is actually one that is about how you create beauty at the site of wound. And that beauty actually has to do with ethics, and that ethical relationship amongst human beings, and again between human beings and other living beings and the planet, is actually what we ought to aspire to. So this is about a particular tradition, but it actually is more broadly about the condition of humanity. That's what I'm trying to reach for.
Good evening. One of the points that you brought up earlier, I haven't had a chance to read the book, but one of the stories that you brought up earlier that really intrigued me was when you spoke about talking to your cousin Ian, I think it was, and how he noticed the blue underneath the tiles. And sort of reflecting on that and your answer to the previous question, the one before this one actually, I'm curious as to what you've learned about how you want to recraft your practice in order to imagine your new ways of creating Black blueness in your work. And in addition to that, in thinking about how I work with young kids, and I think a lot about how we can learn from them to change ourselves, in what ways has your work as a teacher, just interacting with young people in general, inspired you and changed you and how you want to navigate crafting that practice? Does that make sense?
It does. I've only ever worked with young people, so it's sort of, that's the only thing I know. I mean, well, that's not true. When I taught law school, I did teach some returning students, but it's always been part of what you're saying, the sort of listening, and the recognition of the kind of the clarity, the intellectual and also ethical clarity of young. Nobody understands fairness better than a 5-year-old, right? But like it's, you know, you're talking, and certainly as a parent, my kids, I made this decision when they were quite young. As I said, you know, I was like, there's lots, as much as people don't often think this, there's lots of ways to be a good parent. And I said, I have to figure out my way. And my way has to be one where the life of the mind and the sort of spiritual questions are constantly about. And so they are present in every single work that I've done, as are my students' voices don't show up, but it's the things that become clear, what's illuminated, what feels very important to address, what they need to know in order to move forward. It's always all in there. I feel incredibly, I like everybody, but I really like little people and elders. I like the elderly very much, and I like young people a lot. And I think because there's, in both sort of pieces of the spectrum of human experience, there's kind of particular kinds of illumination and insight, right, that people have at the very beginning and towards the end of their lives.
So the last question I'd like to ask before we close is, one of the things that stood out to me about your work is the spirituality that runs through so much of it. And there are so many moments in your books that reading it feels, from my tradition, like a benediction of sorts. Yeah. And there's a lot of young people in this room, to be clear, like very young. But there's a few that I think meet the definition of a young person, you know, the emerging adults, the emerging leaders that are in this room. And not to put pressure on you, but I wondered if you had a kind of word of encouragement that you want to send out that cohort of rising leaders who might be with us or might be watching online. You know, what's your word to them?
So I will say, and this is a thing that I say to my students and my kids, be patient with yourself. There's this pressure to sort of step out in the world and be, and be amazing and show off and do this extra. And, to be tender and patient with your development and your calling, I think is so important. And the most important work that you do is not going to be that which is on display. I think that's it. And also, well, for the people who are going to be teachers, it takes, or who are teachers, I think it takes 3 years with a given subject before you can even say you have any grasp on it. And then it's probably closer to 10. So that's another sign of being patient with yourself. But to just it's not a sprint. It's living as a marathon. Yeah.
Okay, Lindsay, we do have one final quick question from our online audience that I think is another great way to close this, besides that great advice. From Grace Evans, she says, "Hi, Dr. Perry.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your insights. I'd love to know, what are you reading right now?"
Oh. So that's a good question. I had to put it down because it was too thick to carry my suitcase on tour, but I'm reading Nicholas Boggs' forthcoming new biography of James Baldwin. I just finished Patrick Chemezau's Slave Old Man, which is gorgeous. It's translated from the French. He's a writer from Martinique. It's a gorgeous novel. And I just read John Edgar Wideman's Slave Road, and I just read an Annie Ernaux novel, but I can't remember. I read all the time. So there's lots of good things. Oh, can I just say a quick plug, because there's educators in this. My next book will be a middle grade historic 6th to 7th grade pitched piece that I'm working on what school was like in the segregated South.
I was going to ask you what's next, but I thought it was a rude question because you just released this book. So I'm so pleased to know.
Yes.
Please join me in thanking
Thank you all
Dr.
so
Imani
much.
Perry.